My name is Miriam. I'm 43 years old. And that voice you just heard, do not admit her. She is not family. Those words carved themselves into my chest like a blade finding bone. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in the United Kingdom, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in Australia, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. I stood there at those wedding gates, wearing the navy dress I'd chosen so carefully, the one that cost me 3 weeks of overtime because I wanted to look worthy. Worthy of what, you ask? Worthy of walking my own daughter down that aisle. Worthy of sitting in the front row where mothers belong. Worthy of being called family by the people who shared my blood. But blood, as I learned that day, means nothing when money speaks louder. The security guard wouldn't meet my eyes. He was young, maybe 25, probably someone's son who still called his mother every Sunday. His hands shook as he repeated those words that would echo in my skull for months afterward. Ma'am, I'm sorry, but you're not on the list. I have strict orders. You cannot enter. Behind those gates, white roses cascaded down marble columns. I could hear the string quartet warming up, the gentle murmur of guests finding their seats. Guests who were apparently more family than I was. Friends of friends who merited invitations while I stood outside like some beggar at a feast. The irony burned like acid in my throat. For 24 years, I had been Sarah's everything. Father fled when she was 6 months old, couldn't handle the responsibility, couldn't handle the crying, couldn't handle being needed by something so small and helpless. So it was just us. Miriam and Sarah against the world. I worked double shifts at the hospital, my hands cracked from sanitizer, my back aching from bending over bed after bed of broken people. But every paycheck went toward her future. Piano lessons so her fingers could dance across keys. Dance classes so she could move with grace. College tuition so she could escape the life that trapped me. I wore the same winter coat for 8 years so she could have new clothes for school. I ate bologna sandwiches so she could order pizza with her friends. And this was my reward. Standing outside her wedding like a stranger. The worst part wasn't the humiliation, though God knows that burned deep enough. The worst part was the moment when our eyes met through those iron bars. Sarah stood there in her $1,000 dress, the one her new mother-in-law had insisted on purchasing because it simply must be perfect, darling. She looked at me for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds where I saw something flicker across her face, shame, maybe, or recognition of what this moment meant. Then she turned away. My daughter, my baby girl, the child I'd rocked through fevers and held through nightmares, turned her back on me and walked into her new life. I stood there for another 10 minutes, watching the last few guests hurry inside. A woman in pearls glanced at me with curiosity, then whispered something to her companion. They both looked back at me as they passed through those gates I wasn't allowed to cross. The pity in their eyes was almost worse than the rejection. Tell me honestly, if this happened to your mother, would you forgive? Comment, never, if you know some wounds cut too deep. The walk home felt like drowning in slow motion. My feet knew the path 6 blocks down Maple Street, past the coffee shop where Sarah and I used to share hot chocolate on Saturday mornings, past the park where I'd pushed her on swings until my arms ached. Every step was a memory being buried. Mrs. Henderson was watering her roses when I reached my street. She pretended not to see me, but I caught her peering over the fence as I fumbled with my keys. By tomorrow, the whole neighborhood would know. Poor Miriam, locked out of her own daughter's wedding. Poor Miriam, not good enough for the family she raised. The house felt like a tomb. I'd spent the morning arranging white lilies, Sarah's favorite, in every room. I'd imagined coming home to celebrate, maybe with a few close friends, sharing stories about how beautiful she looked, how proud I was. The flowers still sat there, bright and hopeful, mocking me with their freshness. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in Sarah's old room. I hadn't changed it much after she moved out 3 years ago. Her stuffed animals still lined the shelf. The photo of us at her high school graduation still sat on the dresser, both of us grinning, her cap tilted at that ridiculous angle she thought looked sophisticated. Why wasn't I enough? The question crawled through my mind like poison. I'd given her everything I had, everything I was. I'd sacrificed my own dreams, my own chances at love, my own future, all for her. And somehow I still wasn't enough. The phone rang twice that evening. I let it go to voicemail both times. I wasn't ready to hear her voice, wasn't ready for whatever excuse she'd prepared. The silence felt safer, even though it was eating me alive from the inside. I must have dozed off in her chair, because the next thing I knew, my phone was buzzing again. Different number this time. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Mrs. Miriam? The voice was gravelly, older, with the weight of authority behind it. This is James Montgomery. I believe you know my son, David. David. The groom. The man who'd stolen my daughter and apparently convinced her that I wasn't worth a place at their wedding. I'm calling because there's been a development. The wedding has been postponed. They're on their way to see you. My hand tightened around the phone. Postponed. Cancelled, more accurately. I've made some decisions about David's trust fund. Decisions that require your daughter to reconsider her priorities. The line went quiet except for the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. They should be arriving at your house within the hour. They'll likely be distressed. He hung up without another word, leaving me staring at the phone like it might explode. The trust fund. Of course. It always came back to money with these people. David's family had more wealth than I could imagine, old money, generational wealth, the kind that bought silence and opened doors and made people look the other way when convenient. But apparently, that money came with strings. And James Montgomery had just cut them. I set the phone down and waited. For the first time in hours, something that wasn't quite hope stirred in my chest. Not hope for reconciliation. That ship had sailed when Sarah turned away from me at those gates. But hope for something else. Something that tasted like justice. The knock came 47 minutes later. Not the gentle rap of someone asking for a favor, but the desperate pounding of people who needed something badly. I watched through the window as Sarah paced my front porch in her reception dress. She'd changed out of the wedding gown, apparently. David stood behind her, checking his phone obsessively. They knocked again. Then again. I could hear Sarah's voice, muffled through the door. Mom? Mom, please, we need to talk. There's been a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. As if barring me from her wedding was some clerical error, some mix-up with the guest list. I poured myself another glass of wine and sat in my living room, 30 feet from where my daughter begged for my attention. The irony wasn't lost on me. This morning, I was the one on the outside, desperate to be let in. Now the tables had turned, and I found myself holding all the cards. My phone lit up with text messages. First from Sarah, Mom, please answer the door. We really need to talk. Then David, Mrs. Miriam, I apologize for today's confusion. Can we please discuss this like adults? Then Sarah again, I know you're upset, but this is important. Please. Confusion. That's what they were calling it now. I turned my phone face down and finished my wine. Outside, their voices grew more frantic, more desperate. I could hear David on a phone call, his voice tight with panic. Dad, she won't answer. We've been here for an hour. You have to reconsider. The money isn't worth this. But apparently, to James Montgomery, it was. If you've ever been ignored when you needed someone most, you know how it burns. Subscribe if you believe silence sometimes speaks louder than words. The pattern continued for 3 days. They called, they texted, they showed up at my door. Sarah even tried reaching out through old mutual friends, people I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly calling with messages about forgiveness and family and how we all make mistakes. But the most telling call came from my sister Linda on day 2. Miriam, honey, I heard about the wedding situation. Sarah called me crying, says there's been some kind of financial freeze, and she's desperate to make things right with you. Financial freeze, I repeated. Is that what she called it? She says David's father won't release their money until you forgive them. Something about teaching them about family values. Linda paused. Miriam, I know you're hurt, but maybe this is an opportunity to heal things. The money doesn't matter. I almost laughed. The money doesn't matter? Linda, the money is the only reason they're calling. If David's trust fund was secure, you think I'd ever hear from them again? You don't know that. Yes, I do. And so do you. And so does Sarah, which is why she's crying. By day 4, the messages had taken on a different tone. Less apology, more urgency. David's voice cracked when he left his latest voicemail. Mrs. Miriam, our lawyers say the freeze could last months, maybe longer. We can't afford the house payments without that money. Please, can we just sit down and talk? So there it was. The truth, finally. Not regret about hurting me, not genuine remorse about treating me like garbage at my own daughter's wedding. Fear about money. Fear about losing their comfortable life. That evening, I had coffee with Janet, an old friend who happened to be a family lawyer. She listened to the whole story without interrupting, occasionally shaking her head. Sometimes silence is the loudest weapon, she said when I finished. You're doing exactly what you should do. Let them sweat. But Sarah is my daughter. Sarah is a grown woman who chose to humiliate her mother at her own wedding. Actions have consequences, Miriam. You taught her that her whole life, except apparently she forgot the lesson. Janet leaned forward. You want my professional advice? Don't break. Don't respond. Let them understand what it feels like to be powerless. Sometimes that's the only education people get. On day 6, a formal invitation arrived in my mailbox. Thick cardstock, elegant calligraphy, the kind of expensive stationery that screamed old money and refined taste. Mrs. Miriam, you are cordially invited to dinner at the Montgomery estate this Saturday evening at 7 o'clock. We hope to discuss recent misunderstandings and move forward as a family. It was signed by David's mother, Eleanor Montgomery, the same woman who'd insisted I wasn't family enough to attend the wedding. I held that invitation for a long time, feeling its weight, its implications. This wasn't an apology. This was a negotiation. They thought they could wine and dine me into submission, charm me with their wealth and sophistication until I melted like some grateful peasant invited to the palace. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. Saturday evening, I chose my clothes like armor. Emerald green dress, the most expensive thing I owned. Bought for Sarah's college graduation and never worn since. Pearl earrings that had belonged to my mother. Black heels that made me 3 inches taller and infinitely more formidable. I looked in the mirror before leaving and barely recognized myself. For months, I'd felt diminished, reduced to nothing more than an embarrassment to be hidden away. But standing there in my emerald dress, I looked like someone who could walk into any room and command respect. The Montgomery estate sat behind iron gates, much like the ones that had barred me from the wedding. But tonight, those gates swung open for me. Tonight, I was expected, wanted, needed. The house was everything I'd imagined, sprawling, elegant, dripping with the kind of wealth that bought silence and compliance. A uniformed man took my coat. Another led me through hallways lined with oil paintings that probably cost more than my annual salary. They were waiting in what I supposed was the formal dining room. Crystal chandelier casting rainbow shadows across mahogany furniture. China so delicate it looked like it might shatter if you breathed on it wrong. David sat at one end of the table, looking like he'd aged 5 years in a week. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his confidence nowhere to be found. Sarah sat beside him, wearing a simple black dress that made her look younger, more vulnerable. Like the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Eleanor Montgomery presided at the head of the table like some kind of queen holding court. Even James was there, the man whose phone call had started this whole reversal of fortune. Miriam, Eleanor stood as I entered, her smile bright and completely artificial. How lovely you look. Thank you so much for joining us. I said nothing, just took the seat they'd obviously prepared for me, directly across from Sarah, where every expression, every emotion would be on full display. The dinner started with small talk. The weather, the lovely gardens, some charity function Eleanor was organizing. All of it meaningless chatter designed to soften me up, to make me feel included in their world of privilege and power. I played along for exactly 20 minutes. Then Eleanor leaned forward with her most maternal smile. Miriam, we want you to know that what happened at the wedding was simply a misunderstanding. The guest list was so complicated, so many last-minute changes. I'm sure you understand how these things can get confused. A misunderstanding, I repeated, setting down my fork. Exactly. We're all family here, and family forgives these little mix-ups. Sarah reached across the table then, her fingers barely brushing mine. Mom, I'm so sorry. I wanted you there, I swear I did. But there was so much pressure, so many decisions being made by other people. Stop. The word came out harder than I'd intended, but I didn't soften it. Just stop. The table fell silent. Even the soft classical music playing in the background seemed to fade. It was never about family, I continued, my voice steady and cold. It was about money. And now you've lost both. Eleanor's smile flickered but held. Miriam, I think you're being a bit dramatic. Am I? I stood up, and the emerald dress felt like battle armor. Let me tell you about dramatic. Dramatic is working 16-hour shifts to pay for your daughter's wedding dress. Dramatic is eating ramen noodles for 3 months so she can have a perfect engagement party. Dramatic is standing outside your daughter's wedding like some kind of criminal while strangers walk past you into the church. David opened his mouth to speak, but I held up my hand. No, you don't get to talk. You stood there and watched them turn me away. You stood there and said nothing while they told me I wasn't family. You want to know what family is? Family is 24 years of sacrifice. Family is never giving up, never walking away, never turning your back. I was family when it was hard and thankless and expensive. But apparently, I stopped being family the moment it became inconvenient for your precious social status. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Mom, please? Please what? Please forgive you? Please pretend this never happened? Please go back to being the embarrassing mother you hide from your new friends. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You made your choice, Sarah. You chose them over me. You chose their approval over my love. You chose their money over my heart. I walked around the table until I stood directly behind her chair. But here's the thing about choices, they have consequences. And your consequence is learning what it feels like to lose everything. James Montgomery finally spoke. Mrs. Miriam, surely we can reach some kind of understanding. Oh, we understand each other perfectly. You thought you could buy my silence, my compliance, my forgiveness. You thought you could throw me some scraps from your table and I'd be grateful. But you miscalculated. You see, I don't need your money. I don't need your approval. I don't need anything from any of you. I moved toward the door, then turned back for one final word. Enjoy your dinner. Enjoy your beautiful house and your crystal glasses and your expensive wine. Because none of it will buy you back what you threw away. None of it will fix what you broke. And none of it will change the fact that when you needed family most, you had already destroyed it. I walked out of that house with my head high and my heart finally quiet. Would you have stayed at that table or walked away forever? Be real. Drop your answer in the comments. The fallout was swift and brutal. By Monday morning, the story had spread through their social circles like wildfire. Not the truth, of course. They wouldn't dare admit they'd barred the mother of the bride from the wedding. No, their version involved family disputes and unfortunate misunderstandings and differing perspectives on values. But James Montgomery's actions spoke louder than their carefully crafted explanations. The trust fund remained frozen. The wedding gifts were quietly returned. The lavish honeymoon was canceled. David's BMW was repossessed when he couldn't make the payments. I heard all this through the neighborhood gossip network, which proved surprisingly efficient. Mrs. Henderson, who'd pretended not to see me the day of the wedding, now made a point of updating me every time she saw me checking my mail. They had to move out of that fancy townhouse, she reported with barely concealed satisfaction. Saw them loading boxes into a U-Haul yesterday. Sarah looked like she'd been crying for a week. The local newspaper's society page, which had planned to run a glowing feature about the Montgomery-Peterson wedding, instead published a brief notice about the postponement due to family circumstances. But the gossip columnists had a field day. Trust fund troubles torpedo high society wedding. When daddy's money comes with strings attached. The price of family values. I felt no satisfaction in their misery. That surprised me. I'd expected vindication to feel sweeter, more triumphant. Instead, I felt empty. Hollow. Like I'd won a war but lost everything worth fighting for in the process. Sarah called twice more. I let both calls go to voicemail, but listened to the messages later, alone in my kitchen with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. Mom, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But please, can we talk? This silence is killing me. I miss you. I miss us. I made a terrible mistake, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Her voice broke on that last word, and for a moment, I felt my resolve waver. This was my baby, my little girl, the child I'd loved more than my own life. Part of me wanted to call her back, to forgive everything, to pretend the wedding disaster had never happened. But then I remembered standing at those gates. I remembered the pity in strangers' eyes. I remembered the 3 seconds when she looked at me and chose to turn away. Some wounds, I realized, cut too deep for sorry to heal. The second message was shorter. The lawyers want to meet with you. About the trust fund. David's father says he'll only release the money if you agree to mediation. If you agree to work things out as a family. A long pause. I know I don't deserve to ask for anything, but please consider it. Please. I deleted both messages and blocked her number. 3 weeks after the dinner at the Montgomery estate, I received a summons to appear in family court. James Montgomery was petitioning for the trust fund freeze to be reviewed by a judge. Sarah and David were listed as co-petitioners. They were challenging his right to control their financial future based on personal grudges. Janet, my lawyer friend, shook her head when she read the paperwork. They're desperate. This is a Hail Mary pass with no chance of success. The trust was set up with specific moral clauses. James has every right to freeze it based on their behavior. What behavior? I asked. Legally speaking, what did they do wrong? They violated the terms of the trust, which specifically mention respect for family and ethical conduct. Barring a parent from their child's wedding could definitely be construed as a violation of family respect clauses. The court date was set for a Thursday in November. Cold, gray morning that matched my mood perfectly. I wore a simple black suit, professional, serious, someone to be taken seriously. The courthouse was everything you'd expect, marble floors, high ceilings, the kind of formal atmosphere that made you whisper even when whispering wasn't required. Sarah sat at the petitioner's table with David and their lawyer, an expensive-looking man in a $1,000 suit. James Montgomery sat alone at the respondent's table with his own legal team. I was listed as a witness for the respondent, which meant I was theoretically on James's side. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who'd helped destroy my relationship with my daughter was now my ally in court. When they called my name, I walked to the witness stand with steady steps. The bailiff swore me in, and I sat down facing a room full of people whose lives I was about to impact. Sarah's lawyer started the questioning. He was smooth, professional, probably very good at what he did. Mrs. Peterson, can you describe your relationship with your daughter prior to her wedding day? We were close. Very close. I raised her alone from the time she was 6 months old. And you supported her financially throughout her childhood and young adulthood? Yes. Including contributing to wedding expenses? Yes. So you had every expectation of attending her wedding? I looked directly at Sarah when I answered. I had every expectation of being treated like her mother. But you were not invited to the wedding? I was specifically told I was not family and would not be admitted. The lawyer nodded sympathetically. And how did that make you feel? Objection, James's lawyer interrupted. Relevance. I'll allow it, the judge said. I took a breath. It made me feel like 24 years of my life had been a waste. Like every sacrifice I'd made, every dream I'd given up, every dollar I'd spent on her future meant nothing. It made me feel like I was nothing. Sarah was crying now, but I couldn't let that stop me. Mrs. Peterson, do you believe the trust fund should be released? This was the moment everything had been building toward. The question that would determine whether Sarah and David got their money back, whether they could rebuild their comfortable life, whether my silence and forgiveness could be bought. I looked at James Montgomery, who watched me with calculating eyes. I looked at David, who stared at his hands. I looked at Sarah, whose tears fell freely onto the legal papers in front of her. Then I looked at the judge, who waited patiently for my answer. Your Honor, I believe children should face the consequences of their choices. I believe respect and love cannot be bought or sold. And I believe that some lessons can only be learned through loss. I paused, letting the words settle in the silent courtroom. The trust fund should remain frozen. The judge's gavel came down 20 minutes later, upholding James Montgomery's decision. The trust fund would remain frozen indefinitely, pending significant changes in behavior and demonstrated commitment to family values. Sarah sobbed openly as the verdict was read. David put his arm around her, but even he looked defeated. Their expensive lawyer packed his briefcase with sharp, efficient movements that spoke of billable hours wasted on a hopeless case. I walked out of that courtroom without looking back. In the hallway, I could hear Sarah calling my name, her voice echoing off the marble walls. But I kept walking, my heels clicking against the floor like a countdown to something final and irreversible. Outside, the November air bit at my face, sharp and clean. I stood on the courthouse steps and breathed it in, tasting freedom and loss in equal measure. James Montgomery appeared beside me, lighting a cigarette with hands that shook slightly. Thank you, he said simply. I didn't do it for you. I know. He took a long drag. For what it's worth, I'm sorry it came to this. Are you? Or are you just sorry you had to involve yourself in our family drama to teach your son a lesson? He considered this. Both, probably. But mostly sorry that good people like you get hurt by selfish children who take everything for granted. I looked back at the courthouse, where Sarah and David were probably still sitting at that table, trying to figure out what came next. They're not bad people. They're just people who forgot where they came from. Sometimes that's worse than being bad, James said. Bad people know they're bad. Forgetful people think they're righteous. He was right, and we both knew it. 6 months later, I heard through the gossip network that Sarah and David had moved to a smaller apartment across town. David had taken a job at his father's company, entry level, no special treatment, working his way up like everyone else. Sarah was waitressing at a restaurant downtown, something she'd never done in her life. Mrs. Henderson delivered this news with the breathless excitement of someone sharing scandal. Can you imagine? Sarah Peterson serving tables. After all her fancy education. But I could imagine it. I could picture her learning to balance plates, to smile at difficult customers, to work for tips instead of trust funds. Maybe it would teach her something about struggle, about dignity, about the value of earning what you have. Or maybe it would just make her bitter. I honestly didn't know which outcome I hoped for. The hardest part wasn't the silence, though that was hard enough. The hardest part was the dreams. Night after night, I dreamed about Sarah as a little girl. Teaching her to ride a bicycle in the park. Reading bedtime stories in voices for all the different characters. Braiding her hair before school while she chattered about friends and tests and playground drama. In the dreams, she still loved me unconditionally. In the dreams, I was still enough. I'd wake up with tears on my pillow and a hole in my chest that seemed to grow larger every day. Grief, I learned, wasn't just for death. You could grieve the living just as deeply, maybe deeper, because the possibility of reconciliation made the loss somehow more painful. But I'd made my choice, just as Sarah had made hers. And I was learning to live with the consequences. A year after the wedding that never was, I received an unexpected visitor. I was gardening in my backyard, trying to coax life from the rose bushes I'd neglected through the worst of the family crisis, when I heard someone clear their throat behind me. I turned to find a young woman standing by my garden gate. Early 20s, auburn hair, nervous smile. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. "Mrs. Peterson? I'm Emma. I work with Sarah at the restaurant." I set down my gardening gloves and really looked at her. Now I remembered she'd been one of Sarah's college friends, though they'd apparently lost touch after graduation. "Sarah doesn't know I'm here," Emma continued quickly. "But I had to come. I had to tell you what I see every day." I waited. "She talks about you constantly. Stories about when she was little, things you did together, ways you sacrificed for her. She knows she messed up, Mrs. Peterson. She knows she broke something that can't be fixed." "Then why doesn't she?" "Because she's terrified," Emma interrupted. "She's terrified that you hate her. She's terrified that she's lost you forever. She's terrified that even if she apologized 1,000,000 times, it wouldn't be enough." I sat down heavily on my garden bench. "She's not wrong." Emma sat beside me, uninvited but somehow welcome. "Can I tell you something? Sarah saves every penny she makes waitressing. Every tip, every shift meal she doesn't eat, every overtime hour. She's saving it all. For what? To pay you back. For the wedding expenses, for all the money you spent on her over the years. She has this notebook where she's calculated everything: piano lessons, dance classes, college tuition, even an estimate for groceries and clothes and everything else. She's trying to add up 24 years of love and turn it into dollars." The image hit me like a physical blow. Sarah, who'd never had to budget or save or worry about money, sitting at her tiny apartment table with a calculator and a notebook, trying to assign monetary value to a mother's love. "She can't afford that," I said quietly. "No, she can't. It would take her 30 years at current wages. But she's going to try anyway." Emma stood up. "I know it's none of my business, Mrs. Peterson. But watching her try to buy back your love with money she doesn't have, it's heartbreaking." After Emma left, I sat in my garden until the sun went down. The roses I'd been tending looked healthier than they had in months, their new growth reaching toward the light. 2 weeks later, I did something I hadn't done in over a year. I drove to the restaurant where Sarah worked. It was a small place, nothing fancy, the kind of neighborhood spot that survived on good food and loyal customers rather than atmosphere and reputation. Through the window, I could see her moving between tables, order pad in hand, smile bright and professional. She looked different. Thinner, more tired, but also somehow stronger. Like work and struggle had carved away everything soft and unnecessary, leaving behind someone more solid, more real. I almost went inside. Almost walked through that door and sat at one of her tables and ordered coffee and watched her face when she realized her mother was there. But I didn't. Instead, I sat in my car and watched her work, watched her laugh with customers and bus tables and count tips. This was who she was now, not the privileged princess who'd been embarrassed by her mother's middle-class existence, but a woman learning the value of every dollar earned. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was the lesson she needed to learn. I drove home as the sun set behind me, painting the sky in shades of forgiveness I wasn't quite ready to embrace. What would you have done if you were in my place? Forgive or let them burn? Comment below. And if you can hear this story and not subscribe, then be honest, why turn away from truth when it's right in front of you? I never went back to that restaurant. I never called Sarah or answered the cards she sent on my birthday, Mother's Day, Christmas. I never responded to the formal letter of apology her lawyer sent, or the handwritten note that came with it. But sometimes, when I'm tending my garden or sitting in Sarah's old room or lying awake at 3 in the morning, I think about that notebook Emma described. Sarah with her calculator, trying to add up a lifetime of love, trying to turn sacrifice into spreadsheets. They called me a stranger at those wedding gates. Now, finally, I am one by choice. And maybe that's how this story ends. Not with reconciliation or forgiveness or some tearful reunion. Maybe it ends with the understanding that some relationships don't survive the weight of their own betrayals. Maybe it ends with a mother walking away under bright sunlight, finally free from the exhausting work of loving someone who couldn't love her back when it mattered most. Or maybe it ends with the daughter learning that family isn't about money or status or social approval. Maybe it ends with her understanding that the woman who raised her, who sacrificed everything for her future, deserved better than being turned away from her wedding like some unwanted stranger. Maybe someday, when Sarah has saved enough money to feel worthy, when she's learned enough about struggle to understand what her mother endured, when she's grown enough to truly comprehend what she threw away, maybe then we'll have a different conversation. But today, I am walking away. Today, I am choosing myself. Today, I am finally, after 43 years, enough.